proposed for revenues from 1978 to 2008, for revenues and proceeds. The waiver language states that OHA waives and gives up all rights and claims for the income from 78 to 2008 and, quote, any of the tangible right, item, or benefit from the entire public land trust. This is the waiver language. So it's true that the settlement is a very narrow amount, 200 million from certain revenue streams, certain properties. But when you look at the waiver gives up all beneficiary rights, any other tangible right, item, or benefit from the public land trust. This would include our people's rights to walk on the trail, to gather under 7-1. And when you look at the waiver language, you will not be surprised to see that OHA is also waiving the right of native beneficiaries to sue the state and any of its agents. In other words, we would no longer be able to sue the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. At the present time, as was mentioned earlier, there's outstanding litigation brought by the native beneficiaries who are identified in the Admission Act. Why? Because they cannot get a segregation of the trust assets, and also because there's no actual program of services that has ever been developed for the named beneficiary in the Admission Act, which is the Native Hawaiian of 50% blood. I want to point out also to the members of the House that you're being given a red herring. Everyone comes up here and says, you know, we're not going to settle out the overthrow claims. We're not settling out the ownership of the ceded land. Of course we aren't. We can't. Overthrow issues pertain to the United States of America. This legislation doesn't involve the U.S. or any U.S. claims. This legislation involves the states. I'm not interested at all in bringing any federal claims against the U.S. to determine the ownership of the ceded land trust. It's very clear where the ownership is. It's been in the State Admissions Act since 1959. It's Section 5, and it says that the state holds it in trust for 5 purposes. We don't need to go to the federal courts to try to determine who owns the ownership of the ceded land. What we are concerned about is the Hawaiian people obtaining a fair share of the ceded land trust from the state. We are also concerned with how these lands and revenues will be managed. So I wanted to begin by thanking the members of the House for proposing legislation that puts us back on track, so that we can be looking at a proposal of a state agency that needs to be accountable to the native beneficiary as well as the legislature. When I was a trustee of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, I was elected by Hawaiian people. That is no longer the case. OHA is a public agency. OHA represents and is elected by the public, not the native Hawaiians. That means that whenever we are in a situation where it's OHA elected by the public, negotiating a settlement with the Attorney General, who's supposed to represent both trustees, coming out with a waiver of claims on behalf of the natives, it certainly is questionable by my mind, because we're not dealing with native beneficiaries and their elected representatives. We're dealing with a public agency. Also, take a look at that waiver language. You'll see that there's reference in the Senate bill to res judicata, which means that forever our people are waived from raising any claim, even though we would never allow it in the negotiating table, and no information ever made public, even to the state legislature. So while I very much support the House measure, I do have some requests to make of the legislature, and I'm also suggesting possibly some amendments here. I'm very concerned that the deletion of the reference to Article 12 of the Constitution, Section 6, will have an unintended impact. We know that the public land trust consists of the lands, the submerged lands, revenues, proceeds, and natural resources. By deleting references to Article 12, Section 6, we're going to lose that language relating to resources. When I'm looking at the House bill, I don't see anything that refers to natural resources here. As you know, I've been working with my own organization, the Hawaiian Civic Club, for 7 years to try to get the legislature to set policy for bioprospecting. These are the things that are the basis of our culture. And so I'm very concerned that there might be an unintended negative impact here by deleting references to resources that would appear in Section 6 of Article 12. You might be able to correct it by making reference to the public land trust and the revenues, proceeds, but also the natural resources therefrom. It's an oversight, I think, on your part. Now, with regards to the actual meat of your proposal, members of the House, I'm happy to see the waiver language deleted and the settlement language deleted. I think it's inappropriate for the state agency and the government to negotiate a settlement and then just wholesale amend the statutes of our state. Extremely inappropriate. However, members of the legislature, I have to also come to you to point out that you don't just have an obligation to correct the most egregious wrongs in this bill. As legislators, you have the obligation to ensure that the fiduciary trust owed to our people is fulfilled to the highest standards. That is not just a responsibility of the state governor and OHA, but of everyone in the state legislature. I point out to you now that I and many others for several weeks have made repeated requests that have not been answered for the valuation reports of these parcels. If we were dealing with a straight real estate agent, we'd have a phase 1 and 2 report. We'd have some valuation sheet. And I myself demanded it when I sat at the negotiating table as the OHA trustee. I would not discuss Kealaula lands because I knew that they were toxic. Repeatedly, I asked for a toxic report on it. I was never able to get it. Now I see that these toxic dump sites are being included in the parcels of land. And it's not just the Kealaula land toxicity that concerned me, but the abutting parcels. You know, the Tesoro Industrial Park has been cited, I believe it's about 200 times now, for toxic discharge. Now, when you look at the settlement, what are they saying? OHA takes the toxic dump, then OHA has a period of time to spend trust money to do an environmental due diligence, and if OHA can prove the toxic dump site to the state's satisfaction, then OHA has a choice of either giving back the toxic dump site or getting a 25% discount in the value of the land. The fiduciary obligations of trustees require that they obtain for the beneficiary the best possible land. Why are we taking a toxic dump site? Why do I have to read in the front page of the Hilo newspaper that of 11 parcels being transferred to OHA, only 6 are revenue producing? Why would a trustee take 5 parcels of land that are losing money in behalf of a native beneficiary? I wanted to point out also to you that when you take a look at transferring lands and monies to OHA, you have to also ask, you have the fiduciary responsibility to ask, will these properties be cared for in behalf of the beneficiary? Members of the legislature, without coming to Ways and Means, without going to House Finance, without making anything public, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs has now created several limited liability corporations. This past year, lands on Kauai were transferred into Kealaula. This past year, the Waimea Falls Park on Oahu was transferred into Kealaula. A few weeks ago, $500,000 went in there, and now we're waiting for another $4.2 million transfer. I have brought to the legislature the corporate documents of Kealaula, which demonstrate that upon the dissolution of this corporation, all of the assets, lands, and monies will be transferred to nonprofit corporations. This is a mechanism to withdraw land, finances that are assets of our people into private corporate mechanism And I wanted to also inform you that in the last year, Kealaula has formed 3 subsidiary corporations. Only now are they in the legislature with a bill to ask you to legalize this. Have you taken a look at this corporation? I have brought the documents for your purview. I know that you have not received a valuation report for any of these parcels. I doubt whether any was done. I can tell this because I'm hearing your question. You won't get them, and we didn't either. Is this the way the legislature looks after the trust property of our people? I'd like to point out to you that in the last several months, there's been a public and most embarrassing display. Allegations and evidence now surfacing of gross mismanagement of funds at OHA, failure to account for the amounts that have been reimbursed for travel to the mainland, nepotism, violation of the state procurement laws, and violation of other contractual requirements that state agencies are required to abide by. This is in the public forum. There has not been any response from the Attorney General's office, and I don't think that we will see one. That is why today, when I come, I have to ask you to consider 2 alternatives. You're going to proceed to transfer land and money. Put it into an escrow account or receivership. We need to have an audit of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, both a fiscal audit and a management audit. In the alternative, the easier thing to do is hold the measure for a year. Call for the audit, and we need both a fiscal audit and a management audit. And if these audits shall come forward and satisfy the legislature that these mechanisms for holding lands and funds are legal, then perhaps you can consider transferring $200 million of assets to a state agency that your legislative auditor already told you had no master plan for the Hawaiian people. That is why I'm asking that you call for an audit now. We need 2 audits. And I'm asking that in the interest of protecting our people's assets, that you not take this transfer. I am going to leave with Representatives Marimoto and Phoenix copies of documents that I believe raise some pretty serious legal problems with OHA, most of which have already been made public. I'm going to leave with you the corporate documents of Kealaula. I'm going to leave with you the corporate contract for OHA LLC. This was something created by OHA for a media campaign with Barbara Tanabe. Take a look at it. The first contract for $1.1 million. Second contract, $90,000. Third contract, $100,000. Later crossed out and changed to $250,000. These are contracts that state on their face for a campaign that will come into effect after the OHA bill passes. Given the fact that the OHA bill hasn't passed, why have all of these millions of dollars been transferred out of the trust without any monitoring of Ways and Means and House Finance? I'm also leaving with Representatives Stevens and Marimoto a whole list of grants, given out small grants for purposes that purport to be Hawaiian governance. The problem was I couldn't find them reported in the OHA annual statement. Thirdly, documents that will set forth thousands of dollars reimbursed to staffers. We're not able to present receipts for items such as a $1,000 dinner at Tony Roma's in Seattle, Washington. How does this protect the assets of my people? Please look at this. Please send it to the auditor. And finally, for your viewing pleasure, several of the Hawaiian contracts. I'm bringing this to you because I'm trying to show you that we're not in a position to turn over $200 million of land and proceeds to this state agency without getting some accountability. There isn't a rush. There is a great need to get accountability here. And let me ask you, chairs especially, if you're able to come up with evaluation reports on any of these parcels, I would appreciate receiving a copy of it. Having served as an OHA trustee and looked at many of these parcels directly, I haven't been able to get the valuation. I haven't been able to get the formulas. They won't tell me what the $200 million is based on, and it's a totally different figure from what I was working with in 1998 to 2000. Completely a different figure. We need to find out what's behind the figures, and we need to get some accountability. And thank you once again for moving House Bill. House Bill 266, House Draft 1. We cannot allow the Senate bill to move, and please do not include that waiver language. Thank you very much.